So welcome everyone to the DMC's Black History Month speaker event, Bees in the Trap, Migrating Sound and Culture, Disrupting Respectability and Gender with Trap Music with Dr. Kaia Shivers. We would like to thank the 150th Anniversary Diversity Speaker Series for sponsoring this event, and a special thanks to the Center for Women and Gender Equity for collaborating with us for today's event. Attendees, like I said before, please note that the session will be recorded in speaker view and will be made available online following the event. After Dr. Shivers' presentation, there will be a Q&A portion to engage further in conversation about this topic. So without further ado, allow me to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kaia Shivers. Dr. Kaia Shivers is a writer and media studies scholar working in liberal studies at New York University. She is also the editor-in-chief at Arc Republic and founder of Black Farmers Index. She describes her work in 3 words: academia, artistry, and activism, because these aspects of her life often intertwine. Dr. Shivers' research focuses on African religious traditions, Black representations in media, and the African diaspora. Dr. Shivers joins the Dowdy Multicultural Center as the 2022 Black History Month Cultural Heritage Month speaker. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Shivers.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. Dr. Alcidonis, thank you, Yami, for being so accommodating, and thank you all, excuse me, for coming to this talk. Excuse me, I am recovering from COVID, so you will hear a cough here and there, but that is not going to stop the show. Today I'm talking about trap music, and I thought this was really important because just hip hop in general, but in particular subgenres of hip hop such as trap, drill, and bounce music are not critically analyzed the way in which it needs to be analyzed. And so I wanted to delve more into that and look at it from a critical lens. And so this is why I started looking into trap and bounce. Just a little bit about me. I used to be a beat reporter and then an entertainment journalist in Los Angeles, and an entertainment editor. So I saw the rise of hip hop in the golden era and as it begins to shift. So, and I always, and I still have a lot of people in the industry, and we talk often about what has the music industry become. So I'm going to share my, excuse me, my screen with you. And this is what we call a pilot research. I started researching trap in particular, excuse me, in August of this year, bounce and trap. And what I saw is that bounce and trap talk to each other in these very particular ways, but just Southern rap in general. So I'm going to be mentioning a little bit about bounce because in my opinion, there is some significance in it. After I do the talk, I am open for questions. Like I said, I'm still researching it, so it is still very new, and I'm still working through these ideas, okay? And I do get nervous, so please excuse me. I am human. So, and I'm an artist, so I get sensitive about my stuff, but all right, so bees in the trap, migrating sound and culture. This study, like I said, just came out of my interest in subgenres, but also a lot of people do not know that hip hop right now is the most circulated music in the world. It is, you hear hip hop in pop cultures, you hear hip hop, you know, when you travel, and all of the subgenres and all of the takes on it, from reggaeton to Italian trap music to African trap music. But in particular, I was really interested in trap music because unlike other subgenres, trap music has proliferated a lot of the hip hop scene. And I really wanted to know why, because hip hop, I lived in Atlanta. So I was around when trap music begins to percolate. I was in Atlanta from 2004 to 2007. So this is when T.I. is coming out with Rubber Band Man. This is when strip club culture is at its height. So I was really interested in particular why trap music is something that is become something that is the cultural currency that travels the most and is exchanged the most right now out of all the different forms of hip hop. So what is trap music? So first, let's define what that is. I already said it's a subgenre. The phrase trap music was coined by T.I., the rapper, who's from Atlanta, Georgia. It comes out of Atlanta. And in particular, trap music describes, and it comes from working class, poor Atlanta. That's going to be very important. And it comes after what I'm calling the post-crack epidemic of the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s. But more so the 80s and the 90s is when you have the height of a post-crack epidemic era. Another thing about trap music is that it is supposed to, I'm calling it, define the narratives, the rhythms, and the locations of particular areas in Atlanta in the drug trade. There are many different levels of the drug trade, but this is what I call drug peddling, which is one of the lower levels or lowest levels of the drug trade, where you have usually young boys, boys and young men, I should say, young men and boys, usually, but not exclusively, who stand on the corner and they sell small quantities of drugs, right? So trap music comes out when crack is still, crack is still a drug that is very much circulating. In addition to that, you have cannabis, which is at this time illegal. Also, trap music emerges in Atlanta during the rise of the stripper culture or strip club culture. And so a lot of the trap music that you hear comes through strip clubs and women dancing. Hip hop, prior to, when hip hop first emerges, the only way you could hear hip hop or how it was tested on audiences was in New York at the parks. Then it went from that New York and at parks to skating rinks. So a lot of like 90s MCs, Queen Latifah, Naughty by Nature, they actually could not get venues, performance venues. So they would go to roller skating rinks and perform. Well, now in this other wave of hip hop, or this subgenre of hip hop that is considered a moral panic, or sexually or morally questionable, it becomes the main soundtrack in the strip club. So this is why a lot of the rhythms kind of dictate that. Another thing that is very important about trap music that a lot of people don't know, it is after the sampling era. For a long time, hip hop sampled jazz, classical, pop, all these different types of music. But what happened is a lot of these artists began to be sued, the companies began to be sued, and artists lost their royalties. So a way to remedy that is to create a post-sampling era that is made up of these very simple rhythms and beats that you hear in trap music. So prior to trap music, you had songs, you had pieces of singers and chords and orchestras in the music, but the music has been stripped down. And so the last point is that what makes up trap? It's kick, it's bass, and the vocals are particular. And it comes from, in my opinion, what is called call and response out of African diaspora culture and African culture, where the lead person says something and the crowd responds, or within the song you hear a moan and a groan, which is also something that you hear in the Black church. So since we're talking about respectability, I wanted to kind of list what respectability, particularly respectability and Black respectability politics are. And so It's this idea that in order for you to be accepted by larger society, you must carry yourself in a self-regulatory way that fits the establishment or white norms and standards that make you seem like you're not a threat, that make you seem like you are a good citizen, and as well, also to show that you have assimilated culturally and socially. I wanted to zero in, and you are the one responsible. So I wanted to zero in on the third point where it says racially minoritized youth must earn respect and autonomy. This is very important because it is only in non-white communities, Black and brown communities specifically, but I'm zeroing in on Black communities that Black children are often assessed like they are adults. Hence, during the 90s, when now President Joe Biden was a senator, and Hillary and Bill Clinton was the president, and Hillary Clinton was the first lady, there was this emphasis of juveniles, of underage persons being convicted as adults. About 90% of those convictions were Black, and most of those were Black boys. So it's really important to say that because often Black people or people in Black skin are viewed in a way that's radically different, that when white kids do the exact same thing or worse, they are treated as youth, or as youth who are still coming into themselves and evolving and learning about themselves. And so this Black respectability politics is another way that it is described, is that it is you're being suffocated by the hegemony. Your ability to exist, to grow, to be yourself is often quelled in order to accommodate a power structure that is designed and built to keep you oppressed. Y'all with me? I know this is long-winded. And I also must say, this is in the era of pull your pants up politics. And if you know anything about pull your pants up, this comes, or the saying was said over and over again, but this saying was, I would say, attributed and most popularized or connected to Bill Cosby. Ironically, you know, what's going on with Bill Cosby. But Bill Cosby was highly critical of urban youth in the 80s and 90s who did not meet these Black respectability politics. But also you'll see these Black respectability politics playing out in the civil rights era and in Atlanta particularly. So as a result of all of this, this study centers on one question: how is trap music in conversation with the hegemony? And there are sub-genres of that. So I'm looking at Black respectability, I'm looking at gender norms, but I'm also looking at how culture migrates. So before we get into trap music, there's a couple of things that are important about Atlanta in particular. These are the names that Atlanta is known for. Welcome to the A. The A is often called Atlanta, but Atlanta was first called Terminus. Then it was changed to Marthasville, then Atlanta. Then at some point, one of the colloquial terms is Hotlanta. And then some of the, ATL Shawty is one of the ways in which people from Atlanta would say where they're from. If somebody said, where are you from? You say, I'm from ATL Shawty. And so that signified exactly who you are, and particularly who you are, because not everybody said ATL Shawty. That was often something that was employed by the natives, those who had been there for generations. So I want to just kind of briefly go over these really interesting points of Atlanta. Atlanta was called Terminus first because it was the end, it was the stopping point of the Western and Atlantic Railroad station. And so this is really interesting. We're talking about trap music and we're talking about the end and these barricades or these enclosures. And then it was renamed very briefly Marthasville after one of the early governors. But then in 1847, it became Atlanta. Atlanta was founded around 1837 by a lot of Jewish and Greek immigrants to live in Georgia, which was at the bottom of the American colonies in the beginning of the Confederate, mostly immigrants migrated to these territories because New England and those territories were already established by people who had been in the American colonies already for some generations. But one thing about Atlanta, it was considered the pride of the Confederate. These are vintage photos. Both of these photos are somewhere between 1861 and 1865. So this is towards the end of the Civil War. On the left, you have Confederate soldiers who are guarding a home in Atlanta area. And on the right, you see that it's one of the auction houses for enslaved people. So Atlanta was considered the pride of the Confederate, and it was supposed to be a city where whites could, in particular immigrant whites, could establish themselves and grow the Confederate, as well as the financial and the military base of the Confederate. But we know what happens in the Civil War. The Confederate loses, but the whites in the area, even though they are now are forced to be in the Union, there is a lot of resentment that eventually comes out on the Black people post emancipation. So now that at Terminus and at Marthasville is in now called Atlanta, what you're seeing is that in this Atlanta, there's a lot of what we call racial competition. Atlanta, because it is an esteemed metropolis that a lot of effort is going into build into, you also have to have a lot of labor. At this time, a lot of the labor, even craftspersons, were Black people. And so what white Atlantans began to see were Black people beginning to enterprise themselves, having their own barbershops, their own banks, their own schools, their own communities. And so then this begins to grow tension. Another thing that Atlanta has is what's called a Black elite. You have the establishment of 4 universities around this time that still exist. That's Morehouse College, Spelman College, it was called Clark College, Atlanta University. Clark College and Atlanta University in the 80s become one, Clark Atlanta University, and Morris Brown College. So you have a hub of Black intelligentsia that a man like W.E.B. Du Bois, who's a graduate of Harvard, travels down to Atlanta in order to situate himself and as well as study the racial social condition. To this day, W.E.B. Du Bois is one of the only one of the few noted sociologists who comes up with this theory called double consciousness. And so he's part of this Black elite that is establishing themselves, and he creates this idea called the talented 10, where it's 10% of the Black population of these well-educated or enterprising Black people are supposed to be the leaders and kind of lead the Black people into being good citizens and into being Americans and respectful folk. So this is this Black respectability that we're talking about. What happens though, a lot of the Black elite distinguish themselves and even segregate themselves from the working and poor class Black Atlantans, which you will see will carry on into trap music. What happens? So before the Tulsa riots of 1911, there was a huge race riot in 1906 where they say 25 people were killed on record, but what we know about during this time, a lot of the deaths were uncounted for. This race riot actually was so disturbing to W.B. Du Bois, he eventually he leaves Atlanta shortly thereafter. But what the race riots do is that it destabilizes the area and it begins to bring on these new set of laws that are segregationist laws. So before the 1906 riots, Blacks had more, they had more room to move about the city and establish their businesses. But after the raids, post 1906, there were these segregation laws that were created in order to segregate whites and maintain not only power, but economic gaps between whites and blacks. One of the things that was done was called racial zoning, in which Atlanta was remapped, by race. This went from after the race riots all the way up into the 1960s. So what were some of the things that were done in order to remap Atlanta? Sorry. These were some of the things that were done to remap Atlanta. So the overarching idea was, at this time, there was the beginning workings of what they call white flight. White flight is an urban phenomenon in which whites began to leave the urban terrain to the suburbs of America. But the Atlanta leadership, in their efforts to keep a significant white population, began to design their highways and their road systems in ways that would create white enclaves where whites didn't even have to engage with Black people. So that resulted in a lot of streets in the Black community being made into dead ends, building steel barricades, and also concrete roadblocks. So Black people couldn't go into white territories. This is how you have these streets in Atlanta where you have drug activity that goes on in these dead end streets, right? And so what happens, you have this Black experience of Atlanta and you have this white experience of Atlanta that goes on roughly until the Civil Rights era. So in the Civil Rights era, Martin Luther King is part of this Black elite. So in the Civil Rights era, primarily, initially, I should say, the, how do I want to say this? The thrust initially were for Black people to be integrated into capitalistic practices, being able to shop where they want to shop, being able to ride public transportation the way they wanted to, ride public transportation, to eat where they want to eat. So a lot of this was citizenship through capitalistic practices. And Martin Luther King being from the Black elite, it was also about white people seeing Black people as being respectable and human. Thus, one of the ways that the Civil Rights era strategy, one of the strategies used in the Civil Rights era, was when you would protest, you would often wear a business attire, or what we call in the African American community, your Sunday's best. And the thought was, there's going to be a lot of press around. We want to make sure that when the press are there, they capture us in presenting ourselves in upstanding ways. And so if there's any violence towards us, there will be more sympathy. That was one of the strategies. Hence, this is why you rarely saw King without a suit and a tie, or a tie. There's only a few photos of him actually wearing overalls. And that was after he pivoted from what he felt civil rights should be. And he felt, honestly, that the initial work that the Civil Rights era did, he felt actually kept Black people, and he said, in quote, in a burning building. And so he switched to more of economics. And because of the wealth gap that he had seen, not only in Atlanta, but throughout America, between white wealth and Black wealth. So after King dies, there is white flight across the United States, across all cities. A lot of people don't know that the 1960s was called like the red decade or the bloody decade, but there were a lot of protests, there were a lot of deaths, there were a lot of civil unrests. After King died, there were over 100 civil unrests across the city. And so when white flight happened in Atlanta, you had two things. People from other parts of the South who did not have the opportunity to enterprise themselves and establish themselves through education or through business or career moved to Atlanta because Atlanta was the civil rights headquarters, but also people who had left the South and went to places like Chicago, New York. In particular, we're talking about Georgia, so they're going to Newark, they're going to Jersey, they're going to New York, DC, even though that's still the South, moved back to Atlanta in hopes to work with this cadre of civil rights workers and this energy in the city, that promoted citizenship for Black people and economic opportunities. But what happened, okay, let me say this before I go into that. But not what happens. So the first Black mayor in Atlanta, who was very significant, is Maynard Jackson. John Lewis on the right, who recently died a couple of years ago, was one of the civil rights workers who then switches from activism to electoral politics and becomes a very significant figure in both activism and electoral politics until he passes away. Maynard Jackson is very significant as a Black mayor. What a lot of people don't know is that Maynard Jackson was highly backed by the civil rights people in the area because he represented a respectability they felt could provide the adequate leadership that was needed. The name of the other man escaped me. The people loved him more, but he was caught smoking weed. And so they took him off the table. One of the things that Maynard Jackson, one of the many things that Maynard Jackson does is that he passes an ordinance or executive order which says that if you do business in Atlanta, a certain percentage must go to Black businesses, which then creates a middle class in Atlanta like there wasn't any. So more people begin to migrate into Atlanta in the 60s and 70s. And Atlanta is without a doubt a predominantly Black city. This is the airport, which is now an internationally one of the largest airports in the world, or the largest airport in the world, is as a result of Maynard Jackson advocating for Black folk to be there. And so what happens as Black people begin to enterprise, this idea of middle-class living grows, and this elitism grows. At the same time, there's a schism between the middle class, the elite or Black elite and the middle class, and those who are working class and poor. Particularly, a lot of the working class and poor are more of the native born or native Black Atlantans that had been there for generations, and those who had migrated went to these prominent historically Black colleges in the area and then go into government, become doctors and lawyers, are people who migrate into the area, which causes more friction. Also, what happens is, I know I'm setting all this up, it's a little long-winded, but it's so important to understand, is that in the 70s, the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover creates a plan to neutralize Black power organizations, civil rights organizations. And so one of the ways in which it is done is to disseminate drugs in major urban metropolises. First, it starts in Los Angeles and New York, and then it goes to other places. What happens in Atlanta, because of the mass migration, people are coming from Detroit, New York. Not only is the migration bodies, but it also includes a drug trade, and a very lucrative drug trade. Currently, there is a show about one of the largest drug trade trafficking systems that spanned from the West Coast, Los Angeles, all the way to the East Coast. Atlanta was one of the major hubs, and the name of it was the Black Mafia family. There currently is a show by 50 Cent talking about the rise of the Black Mafia family, or Black Family Mafia, I can't remember, that's coming out of Detroit. At the same time, there's also, because of these, there's a lot of legislation, there's a lot of a backlash from the civil rights, legally, as well as you have this systemic racism that still is going on. So even though there was a rise of an elite or a middle class, there begins the decline of a bourgeoisie in Atlanta, hence the emergence of what I'm calling the underbelly. These are these subcultures that are growing, the drug culture and the strip culture. So I list some of the things that are happening in Atlanta. I talked about how Black power was neutralized by the government, and also you have legislators who are doing it. You also have a sadistic police force in Atlanta, the dogs, who targeted Black communities. As well, in the building of Atlanta, if you look at Atlanta, there's a main highway that circles the city of Atlanta, and it presents itself like a trap. Because if anything were to happen, you would have to get past this thoroughfare, which is part of the previous ways in order to enclose or make white people safe. So also you have, and I talked about a lot of these things before, but Atlanta becomes this international city where you have immigrants coming and migrants coming, but it still operates in very localized politics, which then continues to create or contributes to this widening wealth gap. At the same time, in the 90s, you have the introduction, or you have hip hop, but more particularly, you have hip hop that is represented from the South. So dirty South hip hop. So it's spanning from New Orleans all the way to, it's from New Orleans all the way up to Virginia. But New Orleans, Atlanta, Miami become some of them, the headquarters of it. And more particularly, the Dungeon family, which is I would call it a production group comprised of several groups. You have Outkast, you have the Goody Mob, and they become very affluent in the hip hop era in the 90s until the early 2000s. However, even though they're coming from East Point and Bankhead and parts of Atlanta where there are working class poor families, it still does not capture what is going on in the underbelly, and that is the rise of the drug culture and the rise of strip club culture as a way and means for the working and poor class to enterprise themselves, as they were not afforded the opportunity to do it like the Black elite. So when I lost my train of thought. When trap music actually starts to bubble in the 1980s, when there were these like songs about dope, I gotta get out my notes, songs about dope dealing and drug peddling, and it begins to emerge more in the 90s. So this music, even though T.I. frames it, trap music is beginning way before that. So I want to, before I go into the assessment I made, I want to also talk about some elements of trap music just very quickly. So trap music is, there's a distinctive beat, but there's also a cultural aesthetic in trap music that a lot of the earlier, MCs or rappers do. And that is the use of the local colloquial language in Atlanta. If you've ever gone to Atlanta and you've gone to like outside of downtown Atlanta or Buckhead, and you went into the community, a native local Atlantan person speaks a certain type of dialect, one of the things that is done is that sometimes the ending of a word is dropped, you know, or there's a certain type of skip to it. So they like, look at it right here, look at it right here, right? And so that colloquial slang is embedded in trap music. That's very important because that actually is rooted in a survival code that enslaved Black people used in order to create a dialect within English, like a patois, in order to talk around white people who are present, one, and also to present as if they don't know how to articulate the whole word in full, two, so they don't present themselves as either being a threat or being highly intelligent or intelligent as a white man, because we are in a city, like I said, where you have the 1906 race riots. And also I forgot to also mention, if you ever went to Atlanta and you went to a Lake Lanier, that actually was a Black community that established itself after the riots, but was targeted and harassed for so many years. And a lot of people were killed, they left, and the local political establishment then used taxpayer funds in order to direct water there, and it becomes Lake Lanier. So I wanted to do that aesthetic. So what I did is that I assessed the lyrics of several artists that I saw had top 3 Billboard songs and were significant artists in either who are considered trap music artists or have made, I'll call it trap music adjacent, or have made trap songs that that are very significant in the whole lineage of trap music. And so I list them here. Megan Thee Stallion, I'm sorry, I'm placed Megan Thee Stallion twice. Megan Thee Stallion, Nicki Minaj, and Cardi B are the 3 women MCs that are representing in it. Nicki Minaj is not a necessarily trap artist, but she has done trap music. As well as I would say Megan Thee Stallion is half and half. But all the rest of the people are very important. And so I assessed these artists, their lyrics, and as well as look at the cultural ramifications. I want to point out several things that are very important, because the question is that, you know, how is trap music and conversation with the hegemon or hegemony? I forgot to explain what hegemony is. Hegemony is the power structure. And the idea is that hegemony is unstable power. Its power is not static, meaning that it constantly has to retool itself in order to maintain its position in the hierarchy that it establishes. So it often rebalances itself. So let's say if something like hip hop came along, and at first hip hop was considered culturally inferior, and the hegemony or the hegemon disregarded it, but hip hop began to make a lot of money and began to circulate all over the world, which is true, then the hegemon then co-ops hip hop and then makes it part of the power structure. So you'll have people in hip hop who become gatekeepers and power brokers, much like the Black elite and much like those who use Black respectability to monitor people. Okay, so in these, several things that came up. One, the selling of drugs is something either metaphorically or literally are most of the songs. Any song that had any reference of a woman was either as a vixen, excuse me, or as a compliment to the status quo of the rapper in a sexual way. With the exception of that, Cardi, in the women's songs, even though they refer to that, and I said Bodak Yellow, I meant Bodak Yellow. even though they refer to these masculinist, what you call masculinist mentionings, they also mention their sexuality and their ability to not only be dominant over women, but have the sway of men as their power. However, Fetty Wap's Trap Queen is slightly different, because the woman in his song Trap Queen is the main labor force that is used in order to garner money to navigate living in these dire circumstances. And so there's this idea in all of, and I'm going to talk about My President is Black, because that is totally different from what we're talking about. But in majority of the ones where they're talking about, and I'm going to talk about Versace. Majority of them are talking about engaging in illicit activity, but you're engaging in illicit activity in order to enterprise and establish yourself in a capitalistic society. So these artists understand that in a society that is based on market systems, that you must have something to commodify, you must have something to sell. And so rather being used as the commodity, these, this is what people are talking about, how trap music can destabilize the power structure. So instead of capitulating the establishment, trap music recognizes the exploitation and attempts to disrupt it and flip it and publicly acknowledge that they are engaging in illicit activity, but it is only to position themselves in ways in which the society did not do it. As well, I also want to mention the migration of trap music, and this is where bounce music comes in. In 2005, when Hurricane Katrina, it just totally bottomed out in New Orleans. Atlanta became the second, Houston was the first city where you had a lot of New Orleanians migrate. Atlanta was the second one. In that migration, you had the migration of a drug culture, but you also had a migration of bounce music and this idea of a red light district, which also brings the strip club, another strip club culture in there. And as well as this merge of how do women whose bodies and sexuality have been policed in two ways, from Black respectability and the white establishment, for two different reasons. How do you flip that and turn that and assert your own sexual prowess in order to gain visibility? And in this culture of trap music, visibility is power. So not only is capital afford you entry into spaces, but also being seen provides you power to articulate your agenda, which is very evident in My President is Black. So Jeezy puts this song up, My President is Black, even though in it he talks about having cocaine on the scale. My President Black is a very powerful ode to this Black power that comes out of Atlanta. And so even though he doesn't represent the Black elite, he pulls on this idea of Black power and Black prowess, and also respect, and respect, but he situates it in this very kind of blurred capitalistic way. I am going to stop right there. I'm sweating. I hope there are a lot of questions. I have a lot more, but I don't want to run over the time. But I will just talk to you about future things that I'm looking at. There's some more things on gender that I want to explore, because Cardi B, there are other women trap artists. There's Rico Nasty. There's other artists who are not all in trap. There's a Tokyo Vanity as well, who's coming out of New Orleans, but she's like a bounce trap rapper. And I really want to explore more of that, because there is such a dearth in gender. I'm still working through ways in which I can look at this body of work more intimately. But I do welcome your questions, and thank you so much. I don't know what I should do. Should I stop sharing?
Yeah, if you'd like, you can keep it on, whichever one works for you.
I could stop sharing. Okay.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Shivers, and providing that insight behind trap music. I did want to open up the floor then for Q&A. So attendees, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat or unmute, whichever works best.
Okay. I would like to just say a couple of things points that I missed in order to kind of some points. I'm sorry, I started sweating. I didn't look at the notes, but I also want to say that trap represents a convergence of multiple cultures for migrants, and particularly migrants and natives who are in this structure of what I'm calling a dream deferred. Because a lot of these people move to Atlanta with this expectation that the Black Mecca will provide them these opportunities. But what people are finding out is that there's a fight over the resources, because there is still a white establishment that is still in Atlanta that still largely owns things, and it's still part of the decision-making process politically and economically. But because Atlanta is predominantly Black, it presents as if there is real Black power. So this unattainable power is still something that trap music is trying to have this dialogue about in its own way, right? And so I wanted to mention that, and I also wanted to mention, particularly with Jeezy's song, it was really important because Blackness during the Obama era was centered to the presidential elections, and so this song comes in as a way to actually not only because of Obama's different life, because he was raised with his white grandparents, his white mother, and then his white grandparents, there was this question of, well, he's Black, but is he really Black, right? So what happens is that this song by Jeezy kind of validates his Blackness to Black people, and also validates it to white people too. Like, yo, my president is Black. And so that was really important. Then you haven't even talked about the international currents that trap music has, and it's speaking back to America. So I was in Italy for 2 years. There, I was blown away when I walked in, and they had this whole trap in Italian going on. And so there's this conversation that we in the United States don't even know that's going on with us and the music, but trap is not looked at as a drug dealing genre in Italy or even in Africa. It's looked at as a medium for the poor, for the disenfranchised. And so they recognize, they see past this Black respectability lens that a lot of people get caught up in the United States about. And like, no, these are poor people talking about how do you access and obtain power, kind of like by any means necessary. Right. So I wanted to say that. Okay. And I'll stop.
Thank you for that. There was a couple of questions. Someone had asked, what inspired you to start this work surrounding trap music and its impacts on culture?
I'm a hip hop head. I am the second generation of hip hop. Hip hop is my love language is hip hop. However, throughout, there was this whole thing, I should have did that part. So there's this guy named George Lipschitz, really kind of interesting name, but George Lipschitz had this thesis back in the 90s that says Black music or Black people talk to each other through cultural materials that are generated around the world. And back then he was talking about Queen Latifah and, you know, Tribe Called Quest. He's talking about poems and, you know, books and things like that. But I was like, what does that look like now? Because hip hop, I hear more good hip hop in Europe than I hear in the States, right? So what you know what I'm saying? Like, it blows me away. Like, and people are more well-versed in people being in hip hop. Long story short, though, like a lot of origins of rap and everything, it's often blurred and it's erased. So me being from South Central Los Angeles, I remember growing up, what you guys know now as NWA used to sell these mixtapes out of Compton Swap Meet. I was too young to go to Compton Swap Meet, but Toby up the street would go with his mother and get the tapes. And the tapes were about police brutality and about how people were dying of the crack epidemic. So it always bothered me that becomes quote unquote gangster rap when it had nothing to do with being a gangster. It was really about navigating power, which is what trap for me, music is about, navigating power in ill circumstances. Bounce music is about how do you, out of New Orleans, present sexuality when you're not even worried about what anybody is saying about the way your booty twerk, right? I forgot to get into twerking. How did I forget to get into twerking, which is important. I forgot to get into, let me just say this about twerking, okay? Anything out of context becomes vulgar, all right? Twerking, you go to Africa, you go to the Caribbean, you go to indigenous places, even in South America. When I was in Colombia, they were twerking and working it, okay? Because that actual performance or that actual movement is really good for the reproductive system. Isolating your waist and moving your buttocks actually helps in strengthening your reproductive system and keeping your not to have babies. Our reproductive systems just need to be healthy anyway, because hormones are coming from that. So one, it helps in flexibility, strength, because it's our core. That is what you call a core exercise in a Zumba class. But also on the sexuality part as well, expressing your femininity. And doing that is revered. In Yoruba, they have a whole festival called Gele Day, which is celebrating women's vaginas and breasts. And so men dress up as women with these huge vulvas and these huge breasts, talking about giving reverence to these parts of the woman. But anything out of context and placed in the hand of the oppressor then vulgarizes what we think is sacred. Twerking is sacred, okay? It's sacred. All right, I'm sorry. I should have started with that. Twerking is sacred. Let's start from that. I'm so sorry. That's what happens at the end. Dang it. Amen. I know that's right. Amen. I say hallelujah. Okay? Keep it twerking.
For time's sake, we're going to take one more question. Someone asked, I know, I'm sorry.
You should tell me, yo, close it in, be quiet. I start sweating and I get all into it. My apologies.
You're on a roll, and it was a good roll. I did not want to interrupt. But someone had asked, how do you see women in trap moving through respectability politics in the presence of traditionally feminine culture?
So that's an excellent question. I think we have to look at hip hop from a political economic perspective, period. But I'm gonna focus on women and just my understanding of the entertainment industry in general. It is very true. When the Me Too movement came out, the entertainment industry, and particularly hip hop, was overlooked because the sexual assault and as well the exploitation of women, the stealing of women's creative materials and implementing it as their own is virulent in hip hop. The reason why it's not addressed is because a lot of people will have to fork over a lot of money, and there will probably be quite a few people that will be going to jail. right? So what happened in hip hop is that there was a template. So in the industry, and you'll hear this even in other genres and even on TV and film. When there's like a TV show that works, you'll see 50 other TV shows like that. Like Living Single, which starred Queen Latifah and was about Black singles living in, I think, New York. It was successful. And then what happens? I think it's Friends, right? Friends comes out of that. This is what happens in the music industry. Lil' Kim was a tomboy. Y'all know who Lil' Kim is. Lil' Kim was a tomboy. Biggie, her paramour, created the sex vixen that you see called Lil' Kim. I remember Lil' Kim when she had a little mustache right here and she was still chocolate, okay? And very gritty and very raw, straight out of Brooklyn, all right? But that template of being a sex kitten hip hop performer worked. And so the industry began to template this Lil' Kim over and over and over and over again, to where now most female artists coming out have to present their sexuality first, and then they'll present if they're skilled. As opposed to what Lauryn Hill attempted to do was say, I am an artist, I am creative, I'm going to present that in my artistry first, and then my femininity is going to be in the background. It still, defines me, but I want to present to you good work, and I want to present to you work that makes you think. In order to maintain women not being visible, because the civil rights would not go on without women. Civil rights was funded by Black women who sold fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, and pound cake throughout the South. And that is a fact. Trap music cannot kick without women. But when women accept this very peripheral and maligned position and don't collectively come together and begin to push back and create things, then we will forever be invisible, or we will be powerless. But that's part of the template of the vixen. There could only be one. There can only be a diva. There could only be one. And so there are these attempts like WAP with Megan Thee Stallion and who was the other chick? Cardi B. And then there was Hot Girl Summer with Nicki Minaj and Megan Thee Stallion. So there are these very brief collaborations, but if you notice, most female trap artists or rappers do singles or they do features with men. But men trap artists, it'd be 50 dudes on the song. So it creates this cat fight. You understand what I'm saying? So we have got to really deal with that. And that requires women who, like me, like Dr. Alcidonis, actually entering into these spheres and helping negotiate, as well as help these sisters understand. Cardi B could be so much powerful if somebody could just sit her down and really talk to her. You know what I'm saying? Be like, I know you do Santeria. All right, we could do that. Let me tell you some other stuff we can do.